Welcome everyone. Welcome to Boithok's today's session. And with great pleasure, I welcome again you all to today's session on digital humanities, consideration 10 years later. My name is Mahtab Zabin Onto, and I'll be hosting today's session. To let you know, this is the seventh session of our Emerging Humanities series. And in our previous sessions, we have discussed a range of diverse and contemporary topics, including the sociology of literature, introduction to emerging humanities, decolonizing cultural studies, and other areas that connect with the broader field of emerging humanities. Although many of the questions that we explored under emerging humanities have deep intellectual and historical roots, and our purpose is to revisit these questions in light of contemporary realities. We believe that there is a growing need to engage with these areas within literary and cultural studies in order to rethink and reconstruct our academic sphere in Bangladesh. Therefore, we try to bring topics into our discussions that have both academic significance and contemporary relevance. So far, we have not had the opportunity to discuss digital humanities as a specific area of our series. Today's discussion is particularly significant for all of us, and it introduces as a new dimension to our discussion. To briefly introduce to this topic, those who are not aware, we are living in a period where digital technologies have transformed almost every aspect of how we communicate, uh, how we work, research, preserve information, and engage with knowledge. And the humanities naturally have also become part of this transformation. And the intersection of digital technologies with disciplines such as literature, history, language, culture, and the arts has given the rise to what we now understand as digital humanities. In this sense, digital humanities can be seen as a part of the broader conversation around emerging humanities, a field that encourages us to think about how traditional humanities disciplines respond to changing social, cultural, and technological realities. I think it is going to be interesting because it invites us to look beyond the present and think about the emerging possibilities of digital humanities. Uh, the discussion today, therefore, motivates us to think about where digital humanities might go over the next decade and what new forms might digital humanities take, how might emerging technologies influence humanities research and culture studies, and uh, how our understanding of literature, culture, and knowledge change in an increasingly digital environment. And along with this, what opportunities and challenges might lie around. Uh, it is my privilege to introduce our special speaker for today's session, Professor David Zachary Gehring, who is currently a PhD candidate in Cultural Studies program at George Mason University. His academic journey brings together the humanities and the creative industries in an interesting way. As far as I know, after leaving the University of Central Florida in 2002, he entered the music industry in as a professional performer and recording artist, during which time he continued to develop his career in music, touring internationally, and recording music. Later, in 2013, he returned to Old Dominion University, where he earned his MA in Digital Humanities, while continuing to tour internationally and record music. He is currently working on his dissertation, which focuses on intersection of uh, platform capitalism and music culture and its implications for leftist resistance. His background therefore brings together digital humanities, cultural studies, technology, and music, offering a particularly interesting perspective from which to approach to this discussion. So I'm not taking any more time, and without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Gehring to share his thoughts with us on digital humanities, a consideration 10 years later. Professor Gehring, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen in a minute. Just wanted to, again, thank everyone. Thanks, MZR, Sohan, Matab for having me. When, so yeah, I'm a candidate, a PhD candidate currently at George Mason. I got my digital humanities master's in 2016. So as I said to Sam Zero when he initially contacted me about this, it's been some time. 2016 to 2026 is 10 years, hence the title here, 10 years later on. And it's a long time, especially in the digital humanities in terms of any field, right? The development. Um, and that's kind of what I want to do here today is start, with my experience in the digital humanities at Old Dominion. That's where I got my master's degree. And then start to talk about, use that as an entry point to talk about the discipline itself, and then kind of arrive at the contemporary moment and what questions are still being asked in the field, right? So my experience in the digital humanities has been adjacent since I got my master's. Right? I definitely work in adjacent to digital studies in terms of platform capitalism, and I think that now it's difficult to not engage to various degrees with the digital just because of how technology has developed, especially in relation to academia and the humanities. So this is also going to be coming from, my experience has been in the United States. It's not international for me. It's just been Virginia. So it's very kind of localized experience. Just want to kind of mention that as well. But yeah, let me share my screen and um, that's what I want to share. Hold on a second. And let me go up here to, where's present the slideshow? Start. All right. So I earned my philosophy degree in Old Dominion in 2013, and then, as Matab mentioned, I went to the music industry. I'd been in the music industry already, right? So this was me coming kind of back to school and using that experience as a reason to kind of get back into academia because I was interested. And a lot of the things that I began to think about when I was being a musician or out on the road and touring and whatnot. So out of philosophy, I just kind of was not really interested in philosophy. Um, so the humanities was an ideal kind of shift for me, and Old Dominion had a program as the digital humanities. So for me, the digital aspect of this equation was interesting. For me, it was not necessarily about the technology and then kind of hard computer science STEM type of way. It was more about understanding that the digital aspect of our lives were that digital aspect of our life was becoming more and more entwined with our offline experience, right? So for me, it was more about an ontology um, of existence and the way our lives worked out. And I only mention that now because how do I get my when I joined the program, I looked at my transcripts before this discussion, and my classes were pop culture and gender methods. It wasn't necessarily a digital component in terms of that kind of computer science aspect and knowing how to code. and data visualization and things like that. Right. But once I began the program, we had a class called Intro to Digital Humanities, and we read from a series, a book collection
যেগুলো
called,
আমাদের
pardon? All good?
Yeah, continue.
All good.
Okay.
You can
Sorry about that. And so when this book, Debates in the Digital Humanities, I draw from that book a lot in the series. They've released editions in 2012, 2016, 2019, and 2023 is the most recent. And so we started from that book in that class, and that was the first introduction I got to, okay, this question of what is the digital humanities, this kind of need to identify the field, the discipline itself within the academy, within the institution. Um, this was 2016 or 2014. I started the program. This book was released in 2012. By that time, of course, the digital humanities had been kind of um, brewing, right? There's been digital studies. They called it humanities computing in the 80s. So there's this kind of it was building towards this kind of emergence as a discipline, so to speak. And there have been conferences and just kind of self-forming. And so this question in 2012, it was kind of a moment, and we'll kind of get to that in a minute. But these are two kind of approaches to the digital humanities here, and this one's come from 2016, and the others from 2012. The 2012 definition says, at its core, then digital humanities is a more akin to a common methodological outlook or an investment in, or rather than an investment in any one specific set of texts or technologies, right? So this was a method. It wasn't necessarily about, um, it was a way to study the humanities, right? So, and by developing digital tools. And so this led to this kind of approach to the digital humanities that some really kind of focused on the doing of the digital. By that I mean coding. By that I mean kind of getting into the technical aspects of building digital tools and methodologies to study what would traditionally be thought of as humanities-based kind of topics. Primarily, that would be literature at the time. In 2000, there's a lot of focus on using these tools to study literature. And what these tools offered were the capacity to look at large corpus of texts, right? Rather than close reading a book, that was the more of the method up until then. Now we have the ability to kind of look at books and series, historical arcs of literature. Um, and so just approach a different angle of analysis. But I wasn't versed in that at all. And so there's the gentleman named Stephen Ramsey. Um, and he was really big on, look, if you can't code, if you can't do the technical aspect of digital, then you're not really a digital humanist. So it kind of drew a line in the sand of like who could be a digital humanist, who could be in the digital humanities as opposed to the humanities. And people kind of responded pretty strongly to this. This other idea of the digital humanities here from Patrick Svensson, the entanglement of the digital extends to the subject matter of humanistic inquiry. While essentially true for all humanities disciplines, the interconnection is more apparent in some disciplines or areas than others. So for me, this kind of opened up, okay, well, this is more like what I was thinking, right? The entanglement of the digital for me meant, okay, well, yes, we see how our social practices and offline spaces are being mapped into digital spaces and being transferred here. And how the digital and that relationship is also impacting our social practices offline, right? So for me, it was more about reckoning with the fact that a lot of life was happening in digital spaces now. So and for me, someone who's interested in music, digital streaming platforms, social media platforms, Twitter, microblogging sites, all of these recording software platforms. This was all part of the digital. And to study the humanities then for me meant that, yes, we have to reckon with the digital just because this is how our lives are living. But that's a different thing than looking at digital as a method, right? As a method to approaching studies or approaching literary text or approaching any kind of other social phenomena that's worthy of study. And so this is for me this kind of drawing line where it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not someone who codes. I'm not interested in that. So, this program being called the Digital Humanities at Old Dominion was interesting because I didn't, in that program, I wasn't required to learn coding. I wasn't required to learn about data visualization or use new programs in that way. And I think that this for me begins this notion of, okay, how does a discipline identify itself? And what are the dimensions to that identity? Obviously there's an institutional aspect of it. There's also an epistemological aspect to it, methodological aspect to it. How does the digital humanities as a field identify itself? And this is very similar to the conversations we're having in cultural studies still to this day. A lot of the initial courses of the program at George Mason focus specifically or explicitly on, what the cultural studies is. How do cultural studies distinguish itself as a field when it's more of an interdisciplinary approach that involves anthropology, history, philosophy, all these other types of disciplines, right? Um, and so, for example, right, a lot of the chapters from this first edition, Debates in Digital Humanities in 2012, um, one second. Where to go? Sorry about that. Okay. If you see these images, they're taken from chapters where they're just looking at how to analyze text using these kind of machines or these programs that can take in a lot of text, right? It's just a method of literary analysis that's distinct from close reading. So we have macro analytic approach helps us not only to see and understand the operations of a larger literary economy, but by means of scale to better see and understand the degree to which literature and individual authors who manufacture that literature respond or react against literal cultural trends, right? And this article by Catherine Hales, how we read, right? So, and this image there above at the top right there, this the three rises of British literature, right? So these are just methods to study literature. And for me, that wasn't necessarily what I was into about the digital humanities. But this is where it was in 2012. Now, already in 2012, this wasn't just a method, right? This was one aspect of understanding the digital humanities. We also have these same selections from this 2012 edition, right? This is why we fight, defining the values of digital humanities, developing things. This is from Stephen Ramsey, right? The one that was really big on coding. Notes towards an epistemology of the building, notes towards an epistemology of building. Um, Gary Hall, there are no digital humanities. Tom Scheinfeld, Sunset for ideology, Sunrise for methodology. And this is going to speak to the need for a politic in the digital humanities, according to some adherents of the discipline. The need for kind of an open door for critique, right? Because with methodology, it's more about finding ways to approach old questions, right? And finding new ways. And so the idea of critique is not necessarily involved there. It's more about exploring, right? And kind of being more open to this. And then you have the digital humanities situation from Raphael C. Alvarado. So already there's like this kind of reckoning here. I think we have and so this is some quotes from these excerpts, right? And this is from Spiro's "This Is Why We Fight." So this is about values, establishing values for the digital humanities. So beyond this, it's not about methods only, right? It's about saying, okay, who are we and what are we about? Although the debate has generated intellectual energy and compelling exchanges, it has also led me frustrated by statements that seem to devalue the work of fellow digital humanists for longing for a more coherent sense of community. Even as we debate the digital humanities, we need to participate in a frank discussion about what connects us and what values we hold in common. These values in question, their proposed values, are openness, collaboration, collegiality, and connectedness and diversity. So I think it's interesting here that in 2012 we're dealing with this kind of um, the language here is very kind of utopian, right? Openness, collaboration, utopian in relation to what this kind of faith we put in the States, this faith we put in the digital, right? This kind of hope and belief we had in the digital and ICT technologies and Web 2.0 technologies to democratize. And this is part of this kind of fervor, I think. Um, Next, this is from, I keep having to move the screen on my point. There are no digital humanities from Gary Hall. While ideas of this kind are perhaps a little bit too neat and symmetrical to be entirely convincing, the scientific turn in the humanities has been attributed to some kind of crisis of confidence. So here we have an anxiety about what the digital aspect is going to, what it means for the traditional quote unquote methods of humanities and the traditional interest of the humanities. This attitude has led to the latter to colonize the humanist space in the form of biomedicine, neuroscience, theories of cognition, and so on. Is the turn towards computing just the latest manifestation of, in response to this crisis of confidence? Can we go further and ask, is it evidence that certain parts of the humanities are attempting to increase their connection to society and to the instrumentality and functionality of society, especially further from Tom Scheinfeld? We are in a new phase of scholarship that will be dominated by not by ideas, but once again by organizing activities in terms of both organizing knowledge and organizing ourselves and our work. My difficulty in answering the question, what's the big idea in history right now, stems from the fact that as a digital historian, I traffic much less in new theories than new methods. All right. So this goes back to this idea of ideology versus method. And then I think there's one more. Two more, hold on. So this Raphael, this is from the digital humanities situation, right? It just claims there is no definition of the digital humanities, if by definition we mean a consistent set of theoretical concerns and research methods that might be aligned with a given discipline. The category denotes no set of widely shared computational methods that contributes to the work of interpretation, no agreed upon norms or received genres for digital publication. Instead of a definition, we have a genealogy, a network of family resemblances among provisional schools of thought, methodological interests, and preferred tools. So this kind of loosens up the notion, right? Again, this wrestling with what the digital humanities is and what it should be. And this has particular urgency when it comes to placement in the academy, and justifying the digital humanities alongside other disciplines that are established in the academy and in the institution, right? And again, this is 2012. And then this is Joanna Drucker. Um, I'm more interested in this bottom, at the very bottom here. I won't read the whole quote. Have the humanities had any impact on the digital environment? Can we create graphical interfaces and digital platforms from humanistic methods? And so here it's kind of reversing um, the relationship between the digital human and with implied within the digital humanities, saying, okay, well, what have the humanities brought, or what can the humanities bring to digital platforms and graphical interfaces, right? In one sense, if we have the digital impact in how we study traditional human and the humanities, right? What can the humanities bring to the digital? And so that kind of gets to my what I had this notion, this preliminary notion of the digital humanities that I had, and why I was interested in the idea at all, is how this relationship, how they impact each other, right? The digital and the humanities. Um, so I think that those chapters from 2012 are interesting because they just simply show a discipline trying to figure itself out. Despite having been part of certain academic circles before. I mean, you could argue, of course, that the digital humanities stems all the way back to kind of the mid 20th century and this kind of post-wartime economy, excuse me, of the United States, and how research in cybernetics, a lot of state-funded programs began to research um, with new emerging technologies even back then. Right? I'm not necessarily someone that really holds strong to that view because my relationship to the digital humanities is pretty relaxed. I don't really have necessarily a stake really in digital humanities conceived of as a discipline in this way. right? To me, it's more about just recognizing that our digital life and our offline life, so to speak, are now are kind of indistinguishable. And I think there's a quaint kind of approach here to the digital humanities understood as a method, right? So this is from the introduction of this collection, right? Um, in 2012, at a time when many academic institutions are facing austerity budgets, department closings, staffing shortages, the digital humanities experienced a banner year. This is in 2012. Um, that banner year that saw cluster hires at multiple universities, the establishment of new digital humanities centers and initiatives across the globe, and multi-million dollar grants distributed by federal agencies and charitable foundations. Even Google entered the fray, making a series of publicized grants to digital humanities scholars. So in this moment here, the digital humanities is actually kind of showing something counter to what's happening in the humanities more generally, which is an increase in hiring, an increase in academic support, an increase in federal programs or federal attention, let's say, to this discipline. And this is quaint, I think, in a lot of ways, because I think number one, it kind of emphasizes this kind of fetishization of the digital, right? Um, but it also underscores this kind of tension that comes with the suspicion around the digital humanities as this kind of um, I don't know a discipline or a method that begins to dovetail with this notion of the neoliberal university, right? That the digital humanities might be some kind of you know have some role in the the fate of the humanities and the traditional analog humanities sense, right? And we see this tension happening now. I'll get to these slides in a minute, but we begin to see the need for a politic, the politic of the digital humanities to come to emerge and be focused on. And this is something again very similar to the cultural studies debates because cultural studies is one of its distinguishing characteristics, right? And I guess more broadly, we think about emerging humanities, right? What role does a politic have in the humanities and in emerging humanities? Um, and so a lot of the critique of the digital humanities was based on this kind of lack of a politic, right? This kind of tunnel vision where social questions, social tensions were kind of elided by this kind of excitement about the digital as a method, right? And so over the years, you see these kind of chapters in these debates pop up more, emerge within the discipline. Right. Um, so we turn the page now a little bit. And so the digital humanities now critique and a politic. This is from James Sullivan writing now in 2023, not now, 3 years ago in 2023. I do not think it unreasonable to suggest that digital humanities is something of a charged term. Many of its opponents wish it would just go away and stop neoliberalizing and cannibalizing the humanities, while even some of the advocates have grown weary of the what is and what are digital humanities debate on reifying its value to the humanities and figuring out where their new sorts of practices fit in long established disciplinary institutional structures. Re-engaging with the question what are the digital humanities has never been timelier. Digital humanities is everywhere across all continents and cultures and all intellectual communities and research practices. So 2023, 11 years after that first edition of Debating Digital Humanities was published, we still have this question, right? What are the digital humanities? How do we conceive of the digital humanities? But now we have these new tensions, right? Um, that are connected more to the neoliberal university, and then also how it fits alongside the analog humanities, and is it a threat to the longer tradition of the humanities, right? And these questions are always fascinating to me, um, because I there's this kind of I don't know simple or naive approach to me that I hold, that It's just a form of research, right? I mean, the topics and the need for research into the social when it comes to the digital aspect of our lives and in the political economy of the digital. It's all necessary. I think it's all something that's worthy of being studied. The method to me, you know, has never, if we think about digital humanities as a method, right, it's never been much of a problem, a tension, and to me, but there seems to be this kind of anxiety amongst people who are more invested in certain ways in this the digital humanities as a discipline in terms of what the implications are for this kind of focus on the digital, you know. And so maybe it's naive on my part here. So I'm talking to someone, I don't know if you can tell, but it's kind of on the outside of the digital humanities now. But in terms of what's happening to higher education in the United States in particular, in my experience, there of course is a crisis, right? Um, Things are not going well for in higher education, right? So these questions are actually very pertinent and very important, and they have to be tended to. And so we see positions here emerge, in the latter years of this kind of window I'm looking at, where there's more concern about what the digital humanities is, because as the university becomes more under threat, the need to establish itself becomes greater, right? More urgent. And there are some quotes from more later topics here. Adam Gibson, this kind of lays out a nice, um, you know, historical trajectory of the digital humanities. Always have to be careful with these kind of things. They're too general, but I think it does a good job, right? So, and 10 years ago, right, the digital humanities might not have been ready to meet the deepfake challenge. That's a very specific concern. But the field was still young, still coalescing, still largely preoccupied with what qualifies as the digital humanities. The field entered a second phase around 5 years ago as scholars sought to establish connections between the digital humanities and other fields of inquiry across campuses and throughout academies. So this second phase was about institutional identity and institutional placement. We have now entered a third phase, not a moment too soon. The latest iteration insists that the digital humanities must embrace social activism. That we must move beyond the campus and engage the public at all costs. And so this also kind of, for me, mirrors a cultural studies kind of dynamic where you have debates about whether the cultural studies is leaning too hard into kind of a culturalist identity politic focus and moving away from a more Marxist focus. And there are these kind of debates. And again, to me, it's always seemed kind of um, tedious uh, to draw distinctions that way, in terms of as long as, there's a need to study these things and a need to kind of critique power. And I think there's multiple ways to do that, right? But we have this kind of phase in the digital humanities now where they're being pushed to be more social, and I think that's an aspect of the politic, right? This need for by some adherents of digital humanities to develop a politic. What are the social implications of the digital humanities? What can we do to impact the social from a digital humanist perspective, right? Um, and so this is from Matthew Hanna. This is about a political economy focus, right? Rather than defend digital humanities, I argue that digital humanities should instead respond to neoliberalism by advancing a principled, collective, and explicitly anti-neoliberal platform adapted from Marxist theory. Of course, advancing such a digital humanities should not ignore critiques of Marxism from feminist and critical race theorists, but rather suggest intersectional approaches to political economy in keeping with their current theoretical work. So here we have this kind of push, right? That was not there in the initial years of the discipline, right? So as this discipline evolves, we're beginning to wrestle um, with different kind of concerns about kind of how the field connects to to broader society, but also to the institution, to academy, right? Um, and these are some chapter entries from 2023. And you can see this kind of more social aspect of the digital humanities, right? Indigenous protocols matter for the digital humanities, the queer gap in cultural analytics, A Voice Interrupts, Digital Humanities as a Tool to Hear Black Life, Feminist Data Manifest, Introduction to the Four Reflections, Post-Colonial Digital Humanities, The Dark Side of Digital Humanities, which deals with, I mean, this article deals with this kind of problem of neoliberalism in the university and how DH and digital humanities kind of dovetails too comfortably, perhaps, with kind of neoliberal imperatives. AI ethics, digital humanities, towards a political economy of digital humanities, all the work you do not see, labor, digitizers, and foundations of digital humanities. So we see this kind of move towards a kind of more social focus of the digital humanities as a, a target of study, right? So we moved kind of from the literary, right? We kind of moved into this kind of more outward. So what does the digital humanities mean for the social, right? And the more political aspect. And so this is where we can kind of say we come here at this moment, we kind of look to the future, you know. Um, this is from Rafael C. Alvarado again. You see this kind of tension being played out still, right? And I think tension here, I guess, is a focus here that I'm kind of emphasizing, a theme in the digital humanities that should be kind of that can map on to the notion of emergent humanities has to contend with this, you know. Given the zero-sum politics of the academy and the struggle in the public sphere to remain relevant when higher education is regarded by many as a bubble about to burst, we may surmise that the main beef that critics have with digital humanities is not its epistemic status, but its institutional one, even if there are arguments that focus on the former. Whether or not digital humanities survives and what form depends to large extent on the institutional vehicle it takes as transitions from building a discipline to maintaining a discipline within the academy, right? Um, and then there's also, of course, the epistemic and disciplinary dimension, right? And this kind of regionalizes DH a little bit. Um, from a European versus a US perspective. All right. First, there's a consensus among panelists to regard DH as a science in its own right, at least in principle. If it is a science in the sense proposed, then it is nothing more than a rebranded form of linguistics. If so, what do we make of other strongly represented concerns that have no direct connection to linguistics, such as mapping, visualization, and augmented reality, not to mention the activist practices found in the US and elsewhere? And then if there is a will to brand DH as a science in Europe as we and the US as we see movements in the opposite direction to delegitimize digital humanities for masquerading as a science and for adopting its methods as it pursues another goal, that have become a new form of literary criticism and historical research. These come from internal critics of DH who would in fact would rather the field become a kind of media studies or perhaps a science technology or society studies, right? Um, so you know, now we also have the question of AI. And there wasn't much when I was, I didn't have much time to research before this presentation, but there was not much m- focus on the digital humanities as a discipline beyond 2023. And there's not much literature that I've seen in my brief kind of analysis here that dealt with artificial intelligence, AI, machine learning, LLMs, and what have you, right? So that's another question here for the digital humanities, especially considering that in its prior years, 2012, a lot of the focus was on large reading, which involved um, large data sets of just literature being put into a program and mapping patterns, word clouds, right? So in a sense, you kind of have this direct line between digital humanities, LLMs, and the conversation around artificial intelligence, machine intelligence now. But there's not a lot of literature yet that I've seen that really reckon this connection between the digital humanities and AI. It's also worth stating that digital humanities have been a part of a lot of great projects, right? There's color conventions project. There was a project called Dominion that digitally mapped a historically Black community. over time, and that was done through digital mapping. Um, and so for me, it's I'm interested in the institutional question of digital humanities because it parallels to me the cultural studies discussion that we've been involved in and the program at George Mason. Um, and I guess how to put it to this conversation here again, I know that's coming. What's coming is a question and answer period. I don't know if I can answer many questions because, like I said, I've been adjacent to the field for some time, but I do think the conversation can be had about how we approach digital humanities and how we understand digital humanities now. Um, excuse me, because for me, my focus again, platform capitalism is a big part of my studies, in platform capitalism obviously connects to digital humanities very directly, right? In various ways, right? About social practices, communication, identity, political economy, right? Um, And so we're all, to me, this kind of distinction between the digital and the humanities is quaint in a sense because now everything is I would maybe we could talk about this idea. How do we separate the digital humanities from the humanities at this point? It seems like we are in the world of the digital. And so to kind of isolate the digital humanities from the humanities just seems like bad practice. To me, of course, there are people who are in literary analysis, literary critique. You know, I'm coming from one perspective here, right? My perspective to the humanities has never been, as far as my academic career, it's never been separate from the digital. The digital has always had an impact on the humanities, in terms of practices and in terms of research, right? So I'll stop here, um, and then stop share, and then kind of open up hopefully to a discussion again, because I don't know if I can answer many questions. I'll try, of course, if you have some, right? But I think we're all in this space together in terms of research where we're using digital tools. Um, and for many of us across, institutional context and academia, we're kind of treading water in terms of maintaining funding and these kind of institutional questions that bear upon the discipline itself, because some disciplines have always been kind of secure, especially now with computer science and STEM, so to speak, um, engineering, mathematics, and things like that. But again, digital humanities, if digital humanities is a space where these disciplines, that these schools disciplines kind of merge together, then I think this kind of interdisciplinarity is always going to be an advantage, right? So yeah, I guess I'll stop there and then hopefully we can have a discussion together about your experience with the digital in your institution, and how you conceive of the digital in relation to the humanities as a broader discipline.
Thank you very much, Professor Gehring, for such an insightful and uh, thought-provoking discussion. I think this has given us a lot to think about. Since this is our first discussion, focusing especially on digital humanities, I'm sure many of us may have questions, thoughts, and reflections that would like to share. So the floor is open now for questions and discussions, if anyone has any questions. Okay, perhaps I can start the discussion with a question. So, Professor Gehring, anyone wants to talk?
Sorry for the interruption. Yeah, please go ahead.
No,
Kamal
I
has
can
raised
go
his
on.
hands.
Ain Kamal has raised his hand.
So should I continue?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can
Yeah.
carry on, please.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Jack, for your very good talk on digital humanities. I was waiting for your talk actually. understand a little bit about these digital methodologies and what you were talking about, like ideologies. So I have question regarding this, like when you are talking about uh, theories regarding digital humanities, how they are approaching the theories in this field actually, and how you are differentiated between these theories when we bring it in practice as part of our as a methodology. So how you are differentiating between ideologies from the real humanities in digital humanities, because you are, I mean, given your emphasis on some sort of methodological perspective. So uh, how to differentiate between I mean, not like real humanities, if we I can say. I mean, it's like the humanities, traditional humanities we are practicing on a day-to-day basis, and these new methods. So how you are differentiating between them, and how and why, not how, I mean, why you are actually emphasizing on methodologies and not on theories. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a good one because for me, between theories and methodologies, right? Um, I think maybe then, we can say instead of methodologies, why don't we say methods? So between ideologies and methods, I think that from the humanities perspective, you know, in my experience, right, we deal a lot with theory first, right? So we'll look at Althusser and we'll look at, Spivak and we'll look at Donna Haraway, right? These kind of approach like, post-humanism, right? Um, or what have you. And so we have these theoretical models and method and theoretical frameworks, and which then we kind of say, okay, well, let's look at something through this framework, right? Let's look at, for me, the music industry and music production through kind of a Marxist framework or a Frankfurt School, right? Neo-Marxist framework. So entering into the question, right? The question is kind of there's a presumption at the start of the question, right? One that for me, at the very start, I think of music as a commodity, right? I focus on music's commodity form, and then I say, okay, well, that's how I'm kind of viewing music in this. Now, for many folks, music is and it's purely aesthetic, right? It's not a commodity form. It's not treated as such, right? And so I think that would be a theoretical approach, for method, right? And I think the conversation of the digital humanities was refreshing initially because it wasn't about starting from a point of a theory. It was about saying, okay, well, it's just a tool, So it was separate in the sense that even though you might still be able to maintain a theoretical framework first, like say, especially in the context of like literary study, right? Maybe you're looking at new criticism, some kind of, school of criticism. Now you just have the digital is merely just a tool here, right? And so in this sense, the digital remains outside of the kind of ideological messiness of isms that kind of block or maybe kind of um, dissuade or discourage other aspects of understanding this thing, right? And so for many, that was what the hope of the digital was. It just kind of opened up the conversation, allowed things to breathe differently, but also approach an object of study differently. But that's not to say that this approach involved or required a dismissal of one's ideological or theoretical model. It was just say, okay, well, now we can do this, right? But of course, and this is this distinction that I think it was, I forget the author, talked about ideas versus methodologies, right? Um, but now I think that becomes more difficult, maybe, especially for people who are more rooted in the humanities. All right. So now and I speak that as myself, right? It's like, okay, well, I can take digital, I've read books about algorithmic studies to music consumption. I'm still approaching that from a neo-Marxist perspective. All right. But I'm taking advantage of these tools that other people have developed that maybe don't share that same ideology or that same kind of ism, right, from the start. So I think that's where like maybe a distinction between theory and method plays within the digital humanities. But also this is always changing, right? Because people believe different things with this and they approach things methodology. So I think maybe before I end, I'm sorry, I'm rambling on. Methodology then is going to be why you've chosen your method, right? Why, um, are you going to do it this way? And how does your method work within the larger argument you're trying to make? So then it kind of becomes a little more shaky in terms of the method you choose, and how that kind of maybe is ideally kind of remains distinct from an ideology. But anyway, I hope that helped clarify some.
Right, Kamal bhai?
Yeah, yeah. Uh,
Everybody wants
Actually,
answer.
I yeah. I mean, it's a nice insight actually. So I have one more like kind of question. Like you were talking about like the changing scenario of digital humanities, like how humanities actually incorporating ideas from technologies, incorporating ideas from AI generated informations and everything from this whole area. So the thing is, I mean, it is quite common from the earlier versions of like humanities. Humanities people are not just like they're using digital tools now or recently. It was using like quite a long time before. So we are using these tools to understand humanities from a different perspective. So how the scenario changed actually in recent time? I mean, like if we are talking about like uh, I mean, a lot of productions like YouTube productions and like reels and a lot of videos that regularly comes to our, I mean, in bit-sized pieces. Earlier, it came like a big articles and or otherwise like not much this kind of bits and piece size of, I mean, what does it call? Like reels or videos was available there. We usually watch the television and other things. So how this new perspective, I mean, deal with these kind of conditions. Could you shed a light on this? I mean, I'm a little bit interested actually.
I'm not sure I understand exactly.
Will it change the scenario a little bit? I mean, the way
Uh,
I mean, now we are like dealing every day. I mean, we are dealing a lot of different. I mean, even if you see the YouTube productions, every day people are like reproducing thousands of videos and thousands of like artistic elements that
Mhm.
I might say a new kind of art form. Like even you could take that, what does it call? Like graphic novels and this kind of thing that is available now because of this kind of digital intrusion that was earlier was not there, and now you're finding like thousands of graphics novels like each year they're producing. You could talk about animes, animation, films, and other things. That is kind of an artistic production, right? So
Mhm.
how to deal this kind of like huge volume of arts? I mean, it's connected, right? Like this kind of arts are producing every day by peoples, and there are consumers also, like who are there is like some are creating and some are consuming that. So digital humanities, how they will approach this kind of scenario, like new uh, kind of digital methods and approaches, how they could incorporate this kind of huge production of arts.
Yeah, I think that I understand a little more now. So thank you for the clarification. So I'll try to answer or respond to it. I'm not going to, put so much faith that I can answer it. But the the proliferation of digital production, creative digital production, over the years, right? So this is something very interesting to me, again, because initially, right, you have this kind of cyber culture ideology or approach, where in the cyberpunk kind of late 80s, you kind of had this mythology around digital production that was new and exciting, and it was very democratizing. And I do think there's legitimacy to that kind of idea or that reality where you had an era of digital production and kind of Web 2.0 where a lot of these creative endeavors and academic endeavors, right, were able to kind of be developed and executed um, in spaces that were not yet um, defined by or motivated logically, right, by profit, right? There were spaces that existed outside of the kind of imperatives of capital, right? YouTube was a large aspect of that, right? Napster, GarageBand, a lot of different programs and software programs were coming out that allowed folks uh, to produce, right? This idea of the prosumer that came out, right? We have this kind of user-generated content, era of user-generated content. Um, so if we're thinking about now, right, where it still is massive, I mean, you could call, I mean, when I say platform capitalism, we could kind of refer to this idea of the whole economy is built around the way these platforms monetize content, right? When we talk about platform logic, this idea by Gene Burgess, right? How our values and our orientations towards digital life are oriented around how platform capitalism, doesn't force us to do anything, but we enter into these platforms and we essentially have to play by their rules. This is not to say or suggest that there is no freedom within these platforms. This is to suggest that the freedom is then monetized in a way where um, it's becoming the platform logic, so to speak, is becoming such that we change our own behavior if we have ambitions in these spaces, right? So think about platform metrics. Um, I think that it's a big hurdle if we think about democracy and freedom existing in these spaces. Um, we really have to contend with how the proprietors of these platforms and of these spaces direct our content, manage our privacy. You know, there is nothing that there's no space that is not kind of enclosed, I think, at this point by capital and the online spaces. And I know there are spaces of the web that maybe exist outside. I'm not that someone that knows much about torrents or anything like that. So this is something that I can be corrected on. But you mentioned YouTube, and we can mention other platforms like Vimeo, TikTok, open source, open access platforms. Um, in my world, we talk about recording software platforms that are being platformized or, kind of platformization, right? Um, I would simply say, and again, I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, or your comment or not, but I would simply say that right now, what we have to contend with in terms of these spaces where it relies on our content to be monetized for advertisers, it's developed its whole own economy. And that's where we talk about when we talk about the influencer economy, the gig economy, all of this kind of stuff revolves around a logic that was imposed, I would argue, imposed over time, you know, such that we all bought in. I should say I bought in years ago, Facebook, Instagram, all these spaces that are now kind of really associated with kind of sociopathic kind of proprietors of these platforms, right? And AI is part of this conversation as well. We've gotten into a space now where it's hard to kind of imagine freedom outside of it. Um, and so considering, like you said, we've used these tools for a long time, you know, um, just, all these different types of operating systems over the years, that people were able to familiarize themselves with and learn. And they represented this kind of internet culture that did pose, I would argue, pose a threat to owners of capital, Information, free information, access to information is always going to be a threat if you cannot control that information and monetize it and privatize it, right? So that was something that became necessary and urgent for folks who had a vested interest or wanted to invest or kind of, utilize these developments for certain ends. And again, I'm not saying that all of these folks only had money in mind. I think that there's a lot of brilliance in these spaces, these coding spaces, Um, but I think to answer your question now, I think the problem is platform capitalism. I'm always going to be someone who that's my ism, right? I'm going to say, okay, well, I think that the distinction between now and then is the entrance of capital. Um, and that's what I would say. And so again, I'm sorry if I still didn't speak directly to what you're commenting on, but I think that's what I got from it.
Surely it helps. Should I put one more, um, question or comment you could say, if that's not an issue I'm taking too much time maybe. I'm a little bit interested about machine generative translation. Like I myself actually working on some translating some peripheral literature that I intend to use machine learning method like to translate the some poetries and some writings from Bengali to English. Usually it's from a different perspective, but in my case, it's from Bengali to English, the opposite side, opposite direction. So don't you think this actually, this digital humanities and all this scenario, bringing all this digital literacy to this new kind of humanities to generate more or connect with more peripheral literatures, do you think like it will create some sort of uh, division between the traditional big literatures like English literature or French literature and let's say some peripheral literature from a peripheral community? Does it actually more inclusive or will it bring like more exclusions like uh, earlier before or something like that?
I don't know if it will bring exclusions. I think, if you're looking, like you said, you're working on a program that's going to translate text, right? And I think that's a perfect example of a digital humanist tool, right? Um, with what, I don't know, I just don't know. AI is a charged conversation. If we're talking about machine learning and large language models, right? Um, and in relation to scholarly work and research, it's a different conversation. Most of the conversation harbors around generative AI. A class I had last semester it was a critical AI class that dealt with large language models and what they actually do versus this kind of rhetoric of generative AI. Um, I I don't think it'll. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to create more division. I think it depends on, or exclusion. You said, I sorry. I think you said exclusion, not division. Within the humanities, no. I think that there's always going to be a politic around AI, large language models. There's going to be a politic around, and tools in the past, there were politics around those. So I think that the scholarly community is always going to, I think, embrace to one level. This might be putting too much faith in it, but it's going to embrace research, right? Especially if this research can be proven to be beneficial, advantageous, or unique, or contribute in a meaningful way, right? A lot of research still uses AI or large language models, right? Um, and because of how easy they're becoming to use, and I think that was another part of the conversation that of the digital humanities trajectory is that at first it was very difficult to include folks in the digital humanities because these tools required a specialized type of knowledge. But as these tools kind of developed, that specialized type of knowledge became less necessary, and more folks
Exactly.
can now use these tools. And so I think that, now it's easier than ever. And so I think it's not necessarily about excluding folks anymore. I think it's more about hopefully the folks who are included understand the implications of what they're doing in relation to the world around them, in relation to their peers, in relation to intellectual property, in relation to these things that now, we have these tools that are so powerful, and they can produce things that people, and we can have another conversation on whether it's being produced or assembled or what have you, and that's a conversation. But for folks using these tools, and I think that in the intellectual sphere, I would hope that there's a more critical orientation, understanding of what they're doing, like yourself. Like you understand what's happening, but this tools can add value to society in a particular way, right? Add to knowledge, contribute to knowledge. So, I think that the exclusion inclusion issue is not as much of a thing anymore, but I think there new problems might arise with inclusion that's not necessarily. I'm someone that's kind of weirdly into this notion of gatekeeping, I think in a responsible, kind of diverse way, right? So I think that more inclusion is always going to be beneficial, but that inclusion has to come with learning, right? And understanding how to use these tools and understanding the negative externalities of these tools. And understanding the implications for your peers, for yourself, for the environment, and what have you. So I think it's like kind of a dialectic, right? To use my, you're going to have these developments over time, and it's always going to be a tension. Where I think maybe going back to that kind of 2023 piece I quoted, we're still asking and reconciling with what the digital humanities is and who's included in the digital humanities. Thank you for the questions and comments, Nate.
Can I add a comment here? Yeah.
Sure, Sanjeev bhai.
Yes. Okay. Jack, really thank you for a fascinating discussion. And if I understood you correctly, then the digital humanities and the methodology part you discussed, it became really important in this digital humanities, and the difference between the previous study that Nahid Kamal was mentioning, I see it in a way that how the Spotify is suggesting music to people. So, like, I listen to Pink Floyd, and then I listen to Bob Dylan, and the Spotify algorithm will detect Munna as listening to Pink Floyd. Then, as we both are listening to Pink Floyd, and I'm listening to Bob Dylan, so Spotify will suggest Munna to listen to Bob Dylan. So that's the logic behind it. So now it's a kind of computational method to understand psyche, literature. What if I understood you correctly? That is something actually digital humanities is bringing, but there is a immense political part into it. Especially, I became really suspicious when I saw that slides on your presentation that Google invested in the digital humanities, and the first defining moment was 2012, and your degree commenced in 2016. So it's a very fast journey. So there should be some motive behind this first advancement of digital humanities. So yeah, definitely it's a political venture, and even I want to give one example to Nahid Kamal's translation translation related question, that when there is a fascinating paper someone wrote about it, that if you write in Bangla, in Bangla there is only one pronoun for both the gender, but in English you will see he and she, and now the singular them. So uh, if you say uh, সে একজন পুলিশ, সরি জ্যাক, ইটস a বাংলা সেন্টেন্স, so সে একজন পুলিশ, that it the Gemini will translate it as he is a police. If you say সে একজন নার্স, Gemini will translate that she is a nurse, but nurse can become he, or police can become she, but the platform won't detect it. So that's the problem with computational study of the humanities, that it has that human nuance which is lost when you are quantifying uh, the humanities part. So now, what was read traditionally qualitatively, it is now being read quantitatively. So that's the core difference. So sorry if I took long. I don't know how much time you have. Maybe 10 more minutes, because people may be interested to converse with you. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm stopping here.
No, I think that that distinction between the qualitative and the quantitative is massive part of the conversation, especially you mentioned music, and I think I wrote recently a paper on AI and genre, because genre of music, you mentioned Pink Floyd and Bob Dylan. Um, you can associate these artists with genre, like particular genres, right? It's always going to be debated, right? Is Pink Floyd progressive? Yeah, okay, well, I don't know. Is Bob Dylan folk music, protest music, all these kind of things, but genre, as much as it is like a market-oriented kind of organizing of content, cultural products for people who go shopping. It's like, okay, well, I'm gonna go to the rock section, I'm gonna go to the folk section. It's also a social form, right? And what I see and what I'm interested in is, like, if you think about hip hop, or jazz or R&B or blues, and like so many, and again, this is from the US context, right? But you make it global, it becomes even more interesting as the politics of genre get totally lost in how digital streaming platforms arrange genre, right? So, there is this great story, and at this point, it might even be just an example, but I think it was a real story where someone was listening to, I forget, it wasn't Spotify, it was a previous streaming radio service. I forget what it's called right now. Um, and the music was played on someone based on someone's interests, and this interest was based on, okay, well, they listened to this, and so we think we know their identity and blah blah blah. So they played a Celine Dion song or something. And this person became really offended at the fact that, why would you think that me as a music listener is going to like Celine Dion? Right? The algorithm was making a bet, a wager on a type of music that the person likes, a sonic kind of mapping of a composition versus the social implications of listening to that artist for that person, right? And so there's a disconnect there between sonic composition and the subject identity who's listening to that, right? And that's a big deal. A lot of artists sound the same, Bob Dylan and Ed Sheeran in some world could be mapped together in the same kind of sonic mapping, right? But entirely different cultural dispositions and cultural implications for these two artists. Um, I think so. This gap between the qualitative and the quantitative is a big question for the digital humanities, and this was this kind of big. There's a suspicion, like, just because a model can read something and give us some kind of representation of it does not mean the model is interpreting something based on these parameters that you just mentioned, right? In this kind of the linguistic dimensions of a translation. And I think this is a big question. I wonder if tools are getting better. You're saying that's still happening, right? The linguistic disconnect. So, and there's been studies I heard, computing taste, in terms of how genres become contextual rather than kind of based on sonic similarities now. There's all these questions in terms of how these machines, that, as we just mentioned in the last conversation, were now becoming more and more easy to use. How these machines, it becomes an epistemological question. How much faith we put in the knowledge that these machines produce. Um, and do we question data? There's a big data objectivity. That's a big question too, right? And it all kind of centers on digital humanities because they're embracing these tools, but the humanities is rooted in a suspicion of knowledge production, right? A suspicion of how power is involved in knowledge production. And so these kind of things contradict. It's a space of tension, um, I would imagine, in the digital humanities, and based on what I've read. So.
Mm. I'm going to ask a question. May I ask question to Jack? Am I audible to you?
Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, firstly, I am thanking you, Jack. It was a nice discussion and it was so insightful. So my question is, when we think about humanities, and it's very imbricated with politics, as Shamjir Ahmed already has, I think, mentioned about it, and Nahid Kamal was talking about translated aspects and something. So my question is, when we are in the some kinds of metrics, if digital sphere or digital space is one kind of metrics, that's where we are being a subject. Sometimes it's one kind of land that they are providing data, and we are being into that space. So we are somehow controlled, and we know that maybe there is someone or some authority who has control about this data and uh, various kinds of manipulation. So I guess, of course, uh, it is very closely integrated with politics. How you focus it, the I think emerging discipline, digital humanities, with political, I think, aspects, or what will be the politics of digital humanities? This is my question. Thank you again.
Great question. Very first, I mean, it's an interesting question because the digital is still kind of framed in this kind of um, utopian rhetoric, right? So access to information is what the digital provides, and with the information, we become a more informed, knowledgeable society. Therefore, it's an ultimate good for democracy. This has been a framing for a long time. It's not as strong anymore. We have new kind of critical language, even more in the general public now. But I think that kind of notion is still there on the one hand. On the other hand, like you said, you know, our experience and our engagement in these spaces, they are kind of directed, right? There's an interest in terms of how we use these spaces and the data we generate, which is the primary resource in this kind of era of platform capitalism, right? So we have democracy, in terms of information access, set against a need or a logic of control and privatization, right? These two things are contradictory. Um, there's been talk about, how to address this problem. This is a humanities problem, culture studies problem. This is an economic problem. Um, Technological problem. There's been big talk about, oh, well, let's just, a lot of the problem is the black box algorithm, right? No one knows how the algorithm works. So if we don't know how it works, then, how can we address inequalities? How can we address the impact and the results of these algorithms if we don't know how they work? And some people have said, okay, well, and works for me. For someone like me, like if you open up the black box, I'm not going to understand what I'm looking at. I'm still not someone who can understand coded language and how complex these algorithms are, right? There's no way, and not to be a cynic, but understanding how so many of the folks in the United States, and I can't speak for elsewhere, their critical orientation is and critical assessment of information, they're not interested in and they're not really well versed in. And then that's kind of a perhaps a classist comment to make. I guess I'm saying that like you just because you provide information does not mean people are going to be interested in critically assessing that information. Digital literacy is still an issue, right? Um, so when it comes to humanities, the digital humanities, um, the problem the problem is making people understand the connection between control and access. I think making people understand that what they're able to do, which exemplify, this idea of convenience, um, what that enables on the other end, on the more dystopian question of control, right? Um, I think the politics of digital humanities, from my perspective, has to be one that first understands how the political economy of information works and how that's connected directly to how power is sustained, right? The situation in the United States right now is extremely dire. It's not good, you know? And what's the problem? How can you solve the problem? How can you get to the problem? I think, obviously, democracy in the real sense, voting, is a big, substantial, obviously big part. But I think also you have education, you know, and the digital is like lies at the center of that because you have access to information. People have access to information. And, do we believe that information is power? Knowledge is power, so to speak. Um, I do, but I also understand how when I say politics, I could also mean the economy. I could also talk about capitalism, how capitalism has a vested interest in maintaining not necessarily a, an uninformed public, but simply a public that's not going to destabilize their practices, right? Simply a public that goes along with what's happening. It's not that this public can't resist. It's not that the public can't protest. Jody Dean has this notion of communicative capitalism, where in these digital spaces, you know, dissent is a good thing because it just provides data, it just generates data, and data is a commodity, right? So it's not necessarily about censorship, although that's a problem. It's about how the economic system works within this kind of digital space and how data is now this commodity, this resource that lies at the heart of the broader kind of economy, right? We have this kind of conversation about data centers, um, AI, generative AI and theft, intellectual property. All these things kind of center on data, you know. Um, so I'm rambling and I apologize. Your question was good. I think the politics of the digital humanities has to be about regulation. It has to understand how knowledge becomes a commodity. And if you make knowledge a commodity, if you make information and data a commodity, then that intensifies a contradiction of what information is supposed to do. Information is supposed to be liberatory, it's supposed to be emancipatory. But if that information is harnessed politically, economically, then that's a contradiction to me. And so we're not going to get to a liberatory politic without reconciling the economic foundations of how platform capitalism works. But unfortunately, no one that itself is a privileged position to be able to kind of investigate that sense. I mean, we have no health, very bad health insurance here. We have very bad child care here. We have, in the very material sense, not even this kind of elevated talk of ideas and isms, in the very material sense of our lives day to day, we don't have time. We don't have time to do, I'm getting off topic. I apologize, but I think your question kind of sparked this kind of more cynical response and this more concerned response about the digital humanities has to kind of reconcile with, like Sam Zier kind of mentioned, the Google aspect, right? The neoliberalization and how tech, the tech world is so wrapped up and entangled with these kind of fascist motivations and fascist, politics. That's a problem right now, and it's become more and more explicit in the past 10 or so years. You know, social media was like this liberal bastion. People really loved social media and Google. It was very kind of, enlightened kind of approach they sold us in terms of connection and sociality and labor, all these different kinds of aspects of society. So now we have this very kind of bad dynamic where you have tech really in the United States, tech alongside the Trump administration is a bad dynamic for the politics of the digital humanities that relies and still wants to utilize these tools, right? And I think that's what's expressed in these kind of anxieties about some in the digital humanities in terms of what we might give up by using these tools and embracing these kind of um, tools that are associated with big tech and how that kind of implicates or might manifest in the community more broadly. Sorry, I talked too long. I apologize.
Thank you.
Dr. Tiyasha Chakma Didi, do you have anything to share or do you have any question?
Thank you, Mother, for addressing me. Am I coming through clearly?
Yeah, you are audible.
Oh, but I was going to raise my hand, but I was waiting for other speakers or listeners and their thoughts. Um, um, at first, I would like to thank Professor Jack for such wonderful speech lecture and his insights after the presentation. And of course, thank to Boithok for arranging such significant lecture, which is very relevant to the society in this country right now. I was thinking about not question, but more of a conversation actually with Professor Jack. That said, I'm not very, I haven't been studying these digital humanities for a long time, but I was very lucky to take a look into Franco Moretti's studies. So I have a little knowledge on that, and I used his methods in my PhD thesis. So not considering as the methods from digital humanities, but those were suitable for my studies. So when I was working, I had a few questions. For example, I was waiting for those terms in your presentation, but however, I'd like to address that. But what about I'm not going to the other introductory words like accommodating the digital literature or methods, etc. But I'm just very specific. What are the researchers or the scholars are thinking about the copyright issues, which was Nahid Kamal and Manur Islam talking about the productions? Are there any recent studies? That's one of my first question, if I may. And another point is, in my opinion or my guess, that emerging this discipline as, digital humanities, digitalizing humanities or digitalized humanities. This includes two methods, right? Two parts, methods and accommodating the literature or humanities. So we have still a group who strongly believe that hermeneutic science is the best for studying humanities. So I was wondering if you could share your experience or knowledge when what happened in your region regarding facing these challenges with this, the group of people who've tried to hold on to the hermeneutic methods and who were trying to establish these digital approaches. So if you could share that, that would be very lovely.
Yes, I'll do my best. To your first question, or comment about the copyright um,
Issues, right?
issues, I can't point to any specific studies, but I can say that I have read um, articles and recent journals that do reckon with, specifically when it comes to generative AI. So the copyright issues, um, based on the fact that these models um, rely on, they're the word that what we're told is that, these programs, there's a company called, I think it's called Suno. Um, it's a program that you can create pop music on just by prompt kind of, oriented generative AI. And they said that we're only using public, and we're not using any material that's owned by a publisher. All right, so everything that we're generating, we're not stealing anything technically, right? That was proven to be, but there's a study by 404 Media, I think, that proved that to be a lie. So in my world, in terms of music and AI, and there's a lot of conversations about copyright issues and intellectual property and the implications for AI in that space. Um, and even in my kind of more public circles, like this notion that generative AI, they just call it theft. It's all theft. So there is definitely an awareness and concern for that. Now, when it comes to one aspect I didn't talk about, was in terms of the digital humanities, and not only was it kind of emphasized as literary, a way to study literature, but also the digital archive and what the digital humanities offers for um, just a repository of information that's easily accessible, easily organized, and easily manipulated, right? In terms of organize, instead of going to libraries and having to sift through that kind of thing, it becomes more immediately accessible to researchers. Um, and so the copyright situation there in terms of literature, I haven't necessarily read much about, and I think that's because um, when that research was not necessarily about theft, it was about research, right? So they weren't trying to um, find some way. It wasn't about profiting through some various steps off of material that was published by someone else or written by someone else, right? So those conversations didn't come up in my experience. Now, that might have changed, or that might have been just kind of something I was not seen, right? Because again, I wasn't necessarily in the literary space of the digital humanities at any point, right? I just saw that they were doing these things with technologies and programs that could take
Right.
volumes of literature. Um, so that was never a thing that came up. Now, to your second question about the digital humanities and the hermeneutics,
Right.
in my field, now in cultural studies is always that the notion of the digital has been embraced to a degree, but not without equal amounts of skepticism in terms of how exactly kind of your point, like what these tools do. Um, when it comes to interpreting cultural products on content, right? These models don't necessarily, that's not something that we put a lot of faith in terms of kind of a critical human, like a critical approach to interpretation and kind of meaning making out of these
Right.
materials. What these tools can do is, again, with the digital archive, right? You can kind of have them there and you can, patterns are mapped out.
Mhm.
But then you get in these conversations. I think a lot of the criticism lies in people putting too much faith in what they're just recognizing as patterns and this kind of connection between causality and, what's the other word? Causality and I don't know. I forget the word. It's a big one. I don't know why I can think about it, but it simply just means, okay, well, this is not a cause of it. It's just an occasion for it, right? There's no causal connection here, right? So as an example, then it's just like, okay, well, no, there's a lot of suspicion on these how these tools work. Now, the suspicion is also matched with use, like they're utilizing them, but just with a critical eye towards it. There's some books that we read and in one of my classes recently about data science, and how data is used and it becomes, if we have access to data about through these tools and we have access to being able to kind of manipulate that data or interpret that, or I should say, yeah, map that data in a particular way, then that data can kind of be used to nefarious ends. And that's when data becomes subjective, right? And I think that kind of challenges a common notion that data is objective, right? And it's just the data and this is all what you know. Well, I think that the value to this kind of hermeneutic approach is that we can hold that idea kind of in suspect and suspicion, right? So just because the data says something does not mean the data is actually saying anything at all. It's what we're narrating. We create a narrative picture of the data. And this is just a problem in research generally, I think. And not a problem, but people talk about, and a lot of critiques of research is that the data is read wrong. And so now we have tools doing this with a lot more data. And so it just kind of amplifies this issue. So I think to your question, it's kind of in equal parts. I think there's an embrace of digital for sure. But I also think that thankfully there's the humanities side of it, which I think is so important, is that it holds that in suspicion, right? So, okay, well, hold on. Just because this is saying this, we still have to look at it more closely and see what's actually happening with this data and with what these tools are presenting. I hope that kind of speaks to uh, your comment and question. It was a good one. Thank you.
Okay, I just have another relevant. Am I clear?
Yes,
Am I
you are.
clear? Okay, so I was just trying to add another question, maybe, or your insight. Do you think that digital humanities as a discipline or as a method, whatever it is right now, in near future, it can contribute to the copyright issue because it's one of the very significant issue in this part of the region of the world, as we're not fully digitalized for these copyright issues and we're still struggling with implementing these acts. So what do you think these methods or research field or the researchers, or is there any scope that could contribute to this specific matter in near future? Because it's quantitative, definitely, but it discovers qualitative knowledge for us, digital humanities, right? So what are we thinking? What are you thinking in your region? Not the southern part, or this.
Copyright's something that I've only looked at very briefly. It was for a paper I wrote on sampling. I do I do think that if I understand your question correctly, that the digital aspect of the humanities, right, this can definitely be written to appropriately kind of recognize material that's copyrighted, right? If that's the question, if that's the concern you're speaking to, just kind of protecting copyright interest, right? Um, I also know that copyright, especially with the creative industries, right? With music, is so slippery just because of how music works. Um, so we still have trials in terms of, we have litigation, obviously, about music in terms of like, okay, was this a copy of something? is this something did you steal this idea? And to what degree did you steal this idea? And now it's like, so these are litigated in court. And it's always just kind of it's difficult, right? Um,
Uh,
I, in that sense, I mean, I wouldn't put necessarily if there was like an announcement of a tool that proclaimed that they could recognize copyrighted material just by putting that data into the machine and then or into the program, and then that program would say, "Oh, well, this is no," and music specifically. Now, you know, there's copyright in a lot of different areas of spheres of life. So that's a great question. I've never thought about. I've only thought about AI in terms of stealing material, never recognizing stolen material. And so that's a good question. And I think I haven't seen much research on it in my periphery,
okay.
but it has to be a question, right? Because one of the tensions about AI in particular is theft, but the digital humanities, it has to be a focus for many scholars that are, especially copyright scholars, because copyright law is a big deal. So I'd imagine. I'm sorry, it's just not it's not something I can speak too authoritatively on, but aside from my little small corner of music and copyright.
Are you hopeful are you hopeful on this research gap that this discipline, if I may say, uh, might contribute to this problem or challenge
Copyright in
to,
particular?
yes, d-
I
yes,
would say I'm hopeful. Yeah, I'm hopeful in the sense that I think that there's an interest in developing programs that can do that and models and coding that can do that. And then I would have to put, I guess it's MC. I would have some faith in equal interest in this question to be at least approached. Because the thing is, I don't think to add digital tools to this equation would make it necessary. I mean, it could, but it's already such a fuzzy kind of debate, even if we do it with people and we
right.
listen, So, I think it could go either way. So I guess I do have this kind of like, yes, I would be interested. My hope is interest is an indication of my hope in this. Okay, yeah, I do think I'd be interested in learning more about tools that could map out this question. Um, so is hope in the development different than hope in the success of it? Maybe. But I do think that, you know, tools could help us in this kind of question.
Well, thank you. But my observation is perhaps a little intermingling in the intermingling method, like, for example, laws, digital acts, digital laws, and humanities would be a great path to contribute to this challenge. So, yeah, I'm hopeful to see you in this kind of research, you and your other, researchers in this field. And thank
Yeah.
you very much for the lecture. Yes, please.
Oh, no, thank you for the question. I think that, you know, the other question, of course, in digital is how platforms are protected from the
Not
wrongdoing
only
by users, so that's another aspect of the copyright law and permissions.
right, not only for AI, but also reproductions from
Mhm.
digital archives, right?
Yeah. So the question's complex for sure. So yeah, but thank you, of course.
Thank you. Thank you. Mahatab.
Thank you, Tiyashuti. Um, uh, Jack, I have a question. If you would like to answer, there is while digital humanities and new media claim to democratize cultural archiving and algorithmic hegemony, often favors capitalist commodification. Capitalist commodification over genuine diversity. For example, in Bangladesh, where minority spiritual spaces and sacred traditions are increasingly reduced to consumerist tourist spectacles. So, how can digital humanities resist this cooptation, and how digital humanities actively safeguard the sanctity and lived agency of these marginalized cultures rather than just turning them into digital artifacts?
I think maybe primarily two approaches that would then, and this is off the top of my head again. I think that first learning, because the digital, is going to be global, right? And so capitalism is also global. I think that people understanding how traditions operate in various cultures and really, not like exotifying certain things and not and just learning, right? And having a serious approach to how these cultures operate and the meanings that inform cultural practices, number one. And number two, I think again, this is maybe an overly simplistic, but I think just for this kind of conversation, I think that you have to somehow kind of um, present some counter to the logic of capital. I think that I often wonder about capitalism as this kind of, people always call it, oh, it's greed. And that the problem with capitalism is greed. And that is a problem with capitalism. But I think that offloads responsibility onto the individuals who's inappropriately using capital. I think that capitalism operates as a logic, and that logic can appear neutral. But ultimately, I think the logic is destructive. Ultimately, I think the logic is going to take whatever opportunity it can, even in the guise of appreciation and respect, to say, okay, well, how can we monetize this? And I think that once you monetize, or once you kind of and once you apprehend something, especially a cultural practice or especially some aspect of sociality that has existed for a long time and has never really been about spectacle in the sense of financial gain, right? I just think that's part of the logic of capital. And I think that has to be somehow kind of eroded to various degrees when it comes to the line between culture and the relationship between culture and capital, because the relationship is there, right? So yeah, I think learning, number one, and also just kind of trying to understand how to resist the logic. And I think that's the difficulty, the logic of capital. I think we can exist within capitalism and not be greedy. But I also think that the logic of capital is always going to kind of inform certain practices and motivations that can fall under the guise of appreciation and respect, but ultimately they render something in purely economic terms. And I think that's inherently kind of disruptive and destructive kind of logic. But that's what I would start, but that's not an answer. Again, that's just me saying, okay, well, how do we start? What could we enter into the conversation if this is a concern of ours? And it should be.
Thank you, Jack. I think Shohan Sharif has something to share with us in lieu of my question.
No, I think Jack answered my question also. But I have a question for Jack. First of all, I want to say you speak your session was too much insightful for me, and this is the new for this is a wonderful journey for me. My question is, can AI within the digital humanities generally serve as a protective shield for the intellectual property or cultural agency of human translators? Or does computational process inhabitedly reduce their craft on to an autonomous commodity, and this is vice versa also, because sometimes people use ChatGPT to do translate, or generative AI to do translate, but they didn't authored, or they didn't credit AI. So for the time, is anything, but any type, any system, or mm, uh, any tools, or anything can be checked, or can be trace the AI generated text or AI generated translation. Is my question clear?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was muted. My apologies. Are you asking if there can be um, a legitimate use of AI, generative AI? Um, if that's their question, or if that's their comment, I think that yes, I do think there can be productive uses of AI. I think there are a lot of uses of AI, right? When I my mode, I am critical of AI, generally speaking. Like that's my default position. But that position comes from mainly um, the environmental aspects of AI. And I do think that AI presents a problem for pedagogy. I do think that AI in the classroom is an issue. And I do think AI is an issue for cultural production, broadly speaking. But I also know that AI is used for in the medical field. I also know that there are a lot of different reasons to use AI. The question of translation, something simple as that can help people. That can help people learn, that can help people navigate. So I do think that AI can be used responsibly. But again, I think that we're talking about a logic and or motivation in the development of AI that is almost wholly distinct from any kind of humanistic concern by those who are mainly in control of developing those technologies, right? Your open AIs, your chat GPTs, what have you, Anthropics, your Claudes. Uh, so again, it's this issue not necessarily with the tool itself, right? But it's an issue with how the tool is trying to be appropriated and imposed upon society in ways that are unhealthy and in ways that don't concern or don't necessarily take stock of the negative externalities. I think there's a big problem with water consumption. And it's not just AI data centers, right? It's golf courses, it's the agriculture industry, it's climate change, generally speaking. But AI data centers, and the scope and the intensity of the companies wanting to put data centers all over, the United States. And this is, of course, a global thing, but I don't know. I just think that, yes, to your question, I do think there's space for productive and beneficial uses of technology and AI and specifically. But, unfortunately, it's not the conversation right now. And I think I could benefit from spending more time in specifically tech circles about artificial intelligence, or large language models, machine intelligence, um, in terms of use and whatnot. But yes, my general default's criticism, like a critical approach to the critical orientation, suspicion of it. But that's not to say that I think that AI in the health industry is a bad thing. I think it can be used well. It just needs to be specific. It needs to be understood. It needs to be kind of, I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, may I?
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
so my comment or question was raised from this point, that what about developing research or developing newer knowledge for implementing digital tools in our institutions, specifically for our education sector. I remember when I was doing my PhD, a sudden, rule was enacted for the undergrad students and also for graduate students for not using ChatGPT. Well, my PhD was on the translations of Japanese literature, so it was very convenient, but I have never used. And my supervisor advised me to put specifically the word translated by me. So that's my point, that perhaps a more, more specific research or knowledge on how to use or on the rules of usage of these tools and these methods and approach in our education sector would be more helpful to establish this discipline as a stronger one, I believe, for the humanities.
Yeah, I think that there's your comment reminded me of a professor who at Old Dominion, he was part of my thesis advice committee, I think.
Mhm.
But he suggested that no, he utilized AI in the classroom by having students criticize or comment on AI generated summaries, right?
Mhm.
So there's a pedagogical approach to there are creative pedagogical approaches, I think, to AI. Now we're talking about AI specifically. And you also mentioned digital humanities tools. I think that our focus on AI is motivated by a particular reason. It's just because of how it's being used in unhealthy ways, or maybe unproductive, I should say, ways, right? And how, but in the classroom, I'm not a teacher. I'm not someone who has training, pedagogical training. I've adjuncted some courses, right? Um, so I think that in the interest of learning and education, I think that these tools should be understood and researched, and applied in ways that are responsible. I just think that, again, because we have this insistent push to adopt these tools uncritically and quickly into these spaces, it's it's simply a question of like, let's just slow down. We're not, I don't think people broadly are saying, no, 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 no. I think it's becoming that way just because of what's happening. But yeah, I think that there's definitely space for these tools. Now, again, we're talking about, if I were to put the contents of an article into a an AI tool, ChatGPT or whatever, and it summarizes the article, pulls out talking points, pulls out, broad, simplistic summaries, you know, is that the same as using AI to create a picture, a prompt generated AI picture, Arguably no. Again, I don't know the techniques behind that, but those are the kind of questions I think, should be asked, and especially in specific spaces. I want to be clear about that. Same thing with the medical field and education and any kind of research setting, like be specific about how. I think that that would be part of a methodology and a method, right? Clarifying a method would be okay. Well, you know, what's it being used for? How are you using it? And what are and again, you're going to quickly get into a political question though, because then it becomes about the environment, then it becomes about so many other things pretty quickly. However, I do think that the conversation should be had, and I do think there's potential for certain tools to be utilized responsibly in the classroom. Um, you know, and we have I don't know. And again, this is me just talking off the cuff. I don't really, there's a lot of people that are in pedagogy and understanding this more directly than I am, or that I do. So I don't know, but from my position, I would say, okay, well, it all depends. And it's not a fun answer, but I think that's most important.
Jack, I'm sorry from the team because I think we already took a lot of time. And does anyone want to share anything else? Jack, do you?
No, I've enjoyed this very much, and I'm glad that we've gotten so far in the conversation as we have. So I appreciate everything, and thank you so much.
Same feeling here. And if not, then we can proceed to the conclusion. On behalf of my team and the Emerging Humanities series, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to Professor Gehring for being with us today and for sharing his valuable perspective. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us and participated in today's discussion. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you in our upcoming sessions on digital humanities.
Thank you so
Have a
much for having
wonderful
me.
time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jack.